The persistence and courage of this one man expanded Europe's geographical horizons, stimulated trade, and ignited the age of globalization. But it cost the native peoples of the New World millions of lives through disease, slavery, and violence. Although the Vikings had reached the Americas centuries earlier, it was Columbus who made these lands known to the entire world and engraved his name forever into the history of mankind. By the close of the 15th century, Europe stood on the threshold of radical change. It was an age of anxiety and of hope. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the traditional overland routes to Asia, the routes that had supplied Europe with spices, silk, and precious stones, were now in the hands of the Ottoman Empire. Spices and silk became extraordinarily expensive, and the great powers of Europe were pushed to search for another way. The Renaissance transformed the way people thought. The printing press accelerated the spread of knowledge. Geography and astronomy were no longer the privilege of a select few. The world was expanding in the imagination of Europeans, and it was precisely at this moment that the ideas and the men who would change the course of human history were born. Columbus was one of them. He was born in the city of Genoa in Italy in 1451. His family was of modest standing. His father, Domenico Colombo, was a weaver, and his mother, Susanna, was the daughter of a weaver. Domenico belonged to the middle class of Genoa and was a member of the Wool Guild. Christopher had 3 brothers and a sister. Very little has survived about his childhood and early youth. He was short in stature, freckled, with red hair and blue eyes, and was a dreamy child. His religious convictions ran deeper than was usual for his age. He disliked working in his father's workshop and seized every opportunity to go out to sea. He first set sail in 1461 when he was just 10 years old. Columbus received only a brief, formal education. He spoke the Genoese dialect, which was barely understood even in other parts of Italy. He learned to read and write only later in Portugal, where he also mastered Latin, Spanish, and Portuguese. He studied maps and works such as the writings of Strabo and Marco Polo. One of the ideas that inspired him was the map of Paolo Toscanelli, which proposed a westward route to China. By the age of 20, he was already an experienced seafarer. He had sailed the Mediterranean, visited the shores of England and Ireland, and possibly even reached Iceland. In Portugal, he worked as a cartographer and took part in Portuguese maritime ventures. It was there that he married a local noblewoman, Filipa Moniz Perestrello, with whom he had a son, Diego. On these expeditions, he visited the western coast of Africa and reached as far as the Gulf of Guinea. He lived on Madeira and Porto Santo, where he gathered accounts of drifting objects carried by the ocean from the west. In the course of his voyages, he visited the Azores. The Canary Islands served him as an intermediate stop. He came to know that route well, the same route he would later use as the starting point of his first voyage in 1492. The defining trait of Columbus was obsession. He believed that if the Earth was a sphere, then the shores of Asia could be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. In this conviction he was not original. Scholars had long known the Earth's shape. Columbus's mistake lay elsewhere, in his calculations. Of all the existing theories, he chose the ones most convenient for his idea. He underestimated the circumference of the Earth and exaggerated the size of Asia, believing the distance from Europe to Japan across the ocean was only a few thousand kilometers. In reality, it was nearly 4 times greater. The expedition was doomed, had an unknown continent not stood in its way. Bringing Columbus's plan to life required more than 10 years of campaigning for his enterprise of the Indies at the courts of European monarchs. With Portugal pressing its expansion along the African coast, and Bartolomeu Diaz rounding the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, Spain was in urgent need of an alternative route to the riches of the East. Even so, Columbus's calculations were rejected by Portuguese experts, and the Spanish crown long hesitated to back the expedition. After 7 years of waiting, Queen Isabella I, who had at first refused the navigator outright, eventually referred his project to a special commission and granted Columbus a royal stipend. It was only in 1492, after the victory over Boabdil, the last emir of the Emirate of Granada, that Christopher Columbus's hour finally came. Ferdinand and Isabella of Castile gave their consent to finance his enterprise. The Catholic monarch saw in the expedition a chance to break the Portuguese monopoly on the trade routes to East and South Asia by sailing westward, and a mission to spread Christianity. The belief in the legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John in the East fueled their desire to find allies against Islam. The Spanish crown was only a minor shareholder in the venture, but its support opened the door to other investors among merchants and shipowners willing to back the risky enterprise. Among them was the Duke of Medina Sidonia, owner of 100 ships, and the entrepreneurs Juan de la Cosa and Martín Pinzón, who outfitted at their own expense 2 of the 3 caravels and took command of them as captains. The terms Columbus laid before the Spanish monarchs were audacious. He demanded not merely funding, but a status comparable to royalty. He asked for the title of admiral, the offices of viceroy, and governor of all the lands he might discover, and 1/10 of all future revenues. He also insisted on passing the governorship of every newly discovered country to his descendants. The established interest groups who controlled the old routes through the Mediterranean and the Near East had no wish to see a competing route emerge that would erode their influence, and they pushed back hard against Columbus's plans for a new sea passage. Despite the doubts, the crown agreed. And so the great mistake was given its chance to change the world. On August 3, 1492, Christopher Columbus, carrying letters of credence from the Spanish monarchs, addressed to the rulers of India and the Emperor of China, set out from the Spanish port of Palos de la Frontera into the Atlantic. He led a crew of 87 men, divided among 3 sailing ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña. The voyage across the Sea of Darkness became a test of the very limits of human endurance. Fear, discontent, and the constant threat of mutiny shadowed the expedition. Columbus manipulated his crew, recording shorter distances than they had actually sailed in the official log. That deception may well have saved the expedition. After 33 days at sea, on October 12, 1492, land was sighted, the island of Guanahani in the Bahamas, which Columbus named San Salvador. He was certain he had reached the outskirts of Asia. The native inhabitants, the Taino, struck the Europeans as a gentle and defenseless people. From the very first, Columbus saw in them not equals, but a resource, potential servants, slaves, and converts to Christianity. And so was born not only a geographical mistake, but a humanitarian one as well. The gold ornaments he found only deepened his illusions. In search of riches, he sailed onward, discovering Cuba and Hispaniola, the present-day Haiti. It was there that a fateful disaster, the wreck of the Santa Maria, led to the founding of the first European settlement in the New World, the fort of La Navidad. Left behind without supervision, the colonists perished, sparking conflict with the Taíno. It was the first tragic foreshadowing of the conquests to come. On January 16, 1493, leaving the Bay of Samana on the island of Hispaniola, the Spanish ships began their journey home, recrossing the Atlantic on a northeasterly course. On February 12th, a storm struck, and the two vessels lost sight of one another, never to meet again. The arrival of the Pinta in Palos on March 15, 1493, just hours behind the Niña, marked the end of an unspoken rivalry. Captain Martín Alonso Pinzón had hoped to be the first to reach port and report the success to the Crown alone, but Columbus had outpaced him, securing for himself the glory of the discoverer. Columbus's voyage and discoveries created a sensation across Spain and Europe. In April 1493, Columbus made his way across all of Spain to reach Barcelona and the royal court. The journey resembled a religious procession or a triumphal parade. The deepest impression on the court was made by the 6 surviving Taíno Indians whom Columbus had brought with him. They were baptized, and their godparents were King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella themselves. Columbus presented to the monarchs gold masks, ornaments, stuffed parrots, and plants unknown in Europe, including maize and tobacco. Although the gold was modest in quantity, Columbus assured everyone that it was only a small fraction of the riches of the Indies. When he entered the throne room, the monarchs did something they almost never did for a subject. They rose to greet him and allowed him to sit in their presence. It was the highest possible recognition of his new status as Admiral of the Ocean Sea. Meanwhile, Columbus's first expedition had fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape. His discovery created a legal stalemate. Portugal claimed the new lands as its own, since they lay within her latitudes, while Castile and Aragon invoked the right of first discovery, ignoring earlier agreements. Only the head of the Catholic Church could resolve the conflict peacefully. Pope Alexander VI, a native of Aragonese Valencia, in his bull of May 3, 1493, sided in effect with Spain, setting the boundary at 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, was extremely favorable to the Spanish, since it cut off Portugal's room to maneuver in the Atlantic for sailing around Africa. That is precisely why the Portuguese king, John II, pressed hard in the negotiations that followed. In the end, at Tordesillas in 1494, he secured a shift of the line to 370 leagues, which, as it would later turn out, carved off for Portugal a piece of the still undiscovered American continent, Brazil. On his second voyage, Columbus set out as viceroy. This was no longer reconnaissance, but colonization. Thousands of men, soldiers, priests, horses, and weapons arrived in the Caribbean. When Columbus returned to Hispaniola, he found that the first settlement he had left behind was utterly destroyed, and all 39 of his sailors had died in conflicts with the local population. He was forced to found a new town, La Isabela. Illusions collapsed quickly. there was little gold. The colony sank into disease, hunger, and infighting. Unable to govern, Columbus turned to violence. Punitive expeditions, a tribute system, brutal punishments, and slavery became the foundation of the economy, and the population of the native peoples began to plummet. It was the beginning of one of the most devastating demographic collapses in human history. The third expedition, from 1498 to 1500, was for Columbus a moment of his greatest geographical discovery, and at the same time, of his deepest personal downfall. Seeing the powerful current of fresh water flowing from the mouth of the Orinoco River, Columbus understood that such a river could only belong to a vast continent. Yet, being a deeply religious man, he concluded that he had found the edge of the Garden of Eden. While the admiral was charting the shores of Venezuela, the colony on Hispaniola descended into chaos. The Spanish settlers rose up against Columbus's brothers, accusing them of tyranny and of concealing the colony's earnings. Complaints against Columbus flooded the Spanish court. In 1500, the new royal commissioner, Francisco de Bobadilla, arrived with full authority from the crown and arrested Columbus and his brothers. The admiral, who had revealed the New World to Europe, was sent back to Spain in chains. Although Isabella I set him free, his power was lost forever. He kept the titles of admiral and viceroy, but in practice he had lost any real authority over the colonies. Nicolas de Ovando was appointed governor in his place. Columbus was replaced by other men, more pragmatic explorers, who already understood that the newly discovered lands had nothing to do with Asia. Columbus's final expedition became the harshest ordeal of his life. He was already an aging man, suffering from arthritis, yet his obsession with finding a passage to India remained unshaken. He explored the coast of Central America, searching for a strait that would lead him into the Pacific Ocean. Instead, what awaited him was storms, shipwrecks, illness, and humiliation. By the summer of 1503, his ships were no longer seaworthy, and he and his crew were forced to seek shelter among the native inhabitants of Jamaica and wait for rescue. Stranded on the island, Columbus showed both willpower and cunning, using a lunar eclipse to restore his authority over the local population. Knowing from his astronomical tables that an eclipse was approaching, he threatened the natives that he would steal the moon if they refused to supply his crew with food. The eclipse came as predicted, and the terrified islanders resumed their deliveries. But this was only a shadow of his former greatness. A year later, his brother Diego managed to reach Hispaniola and persuaded the Spanish governor to send a ship to rescue the expedition. Columbus returned to Spain in November 1504, just weeks before the death of his greatest patron, Queen Isabella. Without her, his last hope of restoring his rights was gone. He died on May 20th, 1506, in Valladolid, believing until his final breath that he had reached the eastern shores of Asia, not a new continent. His stubbornness became the symbol of an age in which faith, ambition, and greed walked hand in hand with discovery. His mistake changed the course of history. It bound two worlds together and turned into a catastrophe for one of them. Columbus was neither a hero without shadow nor the sole villain of the story. He became the embodiment of progress's tragic paradox, a discovery born of error and a greatness built upon destruction. The history of the New World began with a great mistake, and humanity is still trying to make sense of its consequences.